Hello, welcome out there. Welcome to everybody in AutoCrit land. I'm here with Gareth in his lovely doctor outfit yet again because we are going to be diagnosing a writing problem. Today it's going to be how to fix a broken scene. So, Gareth, you ready to get in and get into these patients and find out what's going on?
I am indeed. I'm along for the ride today, so we're going to be mostly Daniel's diagnosis, and we'll see whether I agree.
There we go. We're gonna see whether or not we agree on our approaches of scene diagnosis. So, diagnosis. There plural of that. See, I'm not medically oriented. Um, we have
Diagnosis
people.
is.
Good diagnosis. Yeah. So we have people visiting or watching from the Atlantic, Kentucky, Florida. That's where I am. I love how there's a few people that are like rainy Florida. It's like, yeah, we can complain because it's slightly cold and it's slightly rainy, and everyone else is like covered in snow. Just how it is. It's like, oh, it's a little cold. Yeah, no, it's really not that bad. But let's go ahead and get started talking about scenes. Now, I think scenes can be sometimes neglected in the writing world because as authors, we'll look at the big overarching picture, that big plot, and we'll look at it kind of that satellite level, right? And then often we'll get down into the nitty gritty of every little line, especially like, opening lines of chapters and dialogue, and we'll just pick apart what we're doing on a line basis, a word basis, and then we don't always split the difference. And sometimes that really matters because scenes are the building blocks of your story. It's, a good metaphor is they're, the bricks of a building. And if a scene is serving its purpose, well, just like in a building, if you took out, too many bricks, it would completely topple the whole building down. Going a little alien here with my camera. Sorry about that. If I'm starting to go a little Harry Potter invisible, I apologize. But you know what I mean, Gareth. Scenes are critical pieces to analyze just as a scene and on an individual basis. How do you tend to just kind of
Well,
approach the idea of a scene in general?
I mean, I think everybody knows. Well, most will know if they are regular viewers here, that I like to kind of break things down into Lego blocks essentially, and view it that way. And scenes are very much like that. They are the building blocks, as Daniel says, of the story, and they link together in a chain that together brings the right moments, produces the right information, and keeps the plot moving. A story is a series of scenes.
Right. It is. Exactly. And you might be wondering, well, then how do you make that work? How do you make them go together? How do you know if a scene is working on its own? That is what we're going to discuss today. So we're going to basically break it down. The way we've been doing these videos is, kind of a bunch of tips. Specifically, we're going to be talking today about broken scenes. So the idea is that you have come to a scene in your book and you've written it, and you don't want to necessarily just get rid of it on the face of it. You think it should be there, but you know it's not working. You can just tell, or you're getting feedback that it's not working from an editor or from other people, and you want to fix it. So, how do you do that? Well, we're going to give you some pointers. Let's start with pointer number one, which is asking yourself, did nothing change for the characters? Because maybe that's why it's broken. You probably can figure out why this would be an issue, right? If you started the scene and you've ended the scene and nothing effectively changed for the characters, they're back where they started. Well, then the question is, why does this scene even need to exist in the first place? Whoa, I'm getting even worse. And if the answer is, well, the scene needs to exist because there's technical information that needs to get out there, there's exposition, then fair enough, but maybe you need to give that exposition in a completely different way, and you need to have events take place that change for the characters. And the truth of the matter is even in an exposition scene, let's say the audience is just getting a lot of information, that should change something for the characters, because if that's not the case, then the information's not even necessary. So the whole thing can just go and nothing will change. It's not going to tear down your building. It's just adding ornamentation that need not exist.
Yeah,
Uh,
one one of
Go ahead.
the things I tend to see as well when this happens is a slow in pacing. However, it can be a real issue sometimes when you're writing something that you want to either reiterate or really drive home how a character has changed, and you want to do that in a dramatic sense. So it's actually a slower scene. It's more personal. And say they're talking to somebody or they're doing something quietly that demonstrates once and for all that this change has happened. That's valid. You know, those kind of scenes happen. But quite often I do see people who have written the scenes and get to that point and think this is just dragging the pacing. That it's stone dead here, and I don't know what to do about it. And usually, some people would say, "Well, take that scene out. We've already got the message." That's not great advice for every story. Sometimes
Right.
that scene is necessary, and it is an
Right.
emotional punch, and it's a good spot. It's a good character moment. But often, if you find that that's the case, it can be that the scene can, like Daniel's saying, there's nothing really happening within that scene. Um, have them opposed to something that causes them to demonstrate that, and that can be that the other character they're talking to is a bit more adversarial, than they currently are. So
Right.
the main character isn't just sitting there saying something and being agreed with
Hmm.
to demonstrate the point you're trying to demonstrate. Give that scene a little bit of conflict baked into it, something that organically grabs the main character and the audience emotionally to drive that point home. So it's not just about the point; it's also about how you're delivering it. And I just wanted to add that as an addendum because does nothing change for the characters? Perhaps sometimes you are simply driving home the fact that something has changed, and that does it shouldn't be boring in itself.
Yeah, no, exactly. When I say nothing's changed, I don't want people to get the wrong impression that that means you can't have like a try fail cycle where the character is attempting to do something and they fail, and so therefore it's like they didn't progress, because that can still be a change. Like in a sports movie, often you'll have a character and they'll keep practicing a move. Well, if they have a scene where they like are really practicing something and they haven't accomplished getting it done, you could say, well, that scene doesn't need to be there, they haven't changed. But no, actually, something did change because they have tried harder and it seems like they're still not getting it, which is
Yeah.
raising the stakes for them, which I think is our next point. Nope, not quite yet. We'll get there. Trackable goal for the scene itself. Think of ask yourself whether or not the scene itself has a trackable goal in terms of somebody trying to accomplish something in the scene. Are things just kind of happening, or is there something that the characters are wanting to accomplish in the scene? Does the scene ask kind of a question? And again, going back to my last example, imagine somebody practicing for something. Well, the goal of that scene would be that they get better at what it is they're working on, right? The scene can be, are we going to break into this building? And then the scene will answer, well, yes, they do, or no, they don't. Things like that. There should be a goal not only for your story at all times for your main character, but also for that specific scene. What are they trying to accomplish in that specific scene? What is the step that they're trying to do? And if you think about that, you might realize that it's probably there. I'm not saying that because it's hard to write a scene where nobody's trying to do anything, right? But what you may have not done is clue into the audience that trackable goal so that they could watch it and they could they could understand why that scene is there and what they're supposed to be concerned about.
Yeah, I'm always harping on about this as well as making sure in any given scene that the goal is clear. We understand what the character is actually going for. And this doesn't have to be a huge, long-winded thing.
Nope.
I talk about this actually as part of our horror writing course, especially for amped up scenes, and it can be as easy as a single word at the beginning of a scene that actually reinforces or reminds people what the goal is. You don't have to go through sentence after sentence, reiterating all the time why this character is involved in this scene. But we should have an idea, a clear notion of what they're trying to actually achieve here. Now, that is not always going to be entirely clear or 100% because you can play with an audience. Remember that. Perhaps when we first meet a character, we can be not quite sure what they're up to, but you're putting enough in the early moments in that scene that people start to guess. They're kind of guessing what this person is up to. And then you change, when their actual goal becomes clear. That's part of the mystery and the surprise and everything of the story. So don't be afraid to play with that. But we certainly want people to have an idea as they're reading that this person is trying to achieve something, that they're not just wandering around in dead space, meandering, doing nothing much. I think, Daniel, your goal is to phase into another dimension today.
I know, right? Yeah, it's okay. I'm generally trapped between two worlds, or maybe I'm the master of two worlds, since I usually write in the fantasy genre, and that's the ultimate goal in the hero's journey, right? What is our next one? Is nothing at stake for the characters? Yeah, we've been talking about this. Maybe again, I would say it's pretty much impossible to write a scene where there's nothing at emotional stake for anybody. But what you can write is a scene where the audience is not clued into this, the audience is not tracking it, you're not emphasizing enough to figure out what it is that they are what matters to them, because yes, there's a goal, but then the goal should be more than that. The goal should also have emotional consequences that come with that, emotional reasons for it.
Yeah, I'll be giving away a little bit here, but again, we talk about this during course time too. Is when you're knowing about the goal, is also understanding what the threat of loss is. What will they suffer if that goal is not met? What is at stake? And again, we should understand that going into any scene. So it's a good one to see if you think a scene is a bit stagnant or kind of dying there and not much is really happening, but you're confused about it. It's like the scene feels broken, but the characters are active. They're kind of doing something. Perhaps it might be that you just haven't ticked the box of setting that expectation of something bad will happen if they don't achieve this, not like or something good will happen. What is it that they're actually trying to achieve? Making that clear, because it primes us to want to see what happens. We're going to guess either way. Is it going to go well? Is it going to go bad? But we have to have a notion that that's even on the table, and sometimes that's all that's missing.
Exactly. People are saying careful with shirt. Yes, there's a little bit of green in this shirt, and that is the problem, right? It's the old weatherman effect where they're floating. So, but it gives a little bit of visual interest. It's the pattern. Yes. Yeah, you're right. It's true. I wasn't thinking. Okay. All right. It's just to add interest to the scene, right? It's a little bit of color. Get into the senses. It could be that actually what is broken about your scene is that you've fallen into this kind of paint by numbers approach where you're just kind of telling what's going on. You're not really putting the audience in with the characters. You're not really immersing them into the tension or the action. You're just kind of relaying it. People often say, show, don't tell. Around here, we like to say dramatize, don't summarize. So if your scene feels like a summary of something versus a true dramatization of something, that's going to break the scene. And one thing you can look into for that is, are you really tapping into all the senses? And think of all the different senses. I don't necessarily think you have to, rattle it off and be like, okay, I'm going to cover every all five sentences in this scene. But maybe you have neglected certain ones. You have characters just looking around and it's just all visual and there's nothing about the sound, or there's nothing about the feeling, or there's nothing about taste if they're eating something. Like it just depends. Not getting rich and vibrant in your detail can make a scene really bland, and it just doesn't work very well.
Yeah. I think this one, 100% too. This When this happens, I would usually say to people, well, that's a lot of events, that's a lot of things happening, but I don't
Right.
feel any of it.
Mm-mm.
I'm not actually there. You're not letting me smell, touch,
Yeah. Right.
roll around in this world with this character, and also don't miss out on even though you get the sensory information, tying that to psychological responses as
Of
well.
course.
Um, Bring it to life that way. It's way more than this. This is going beyond. Uh, in really good writing, when we're talking prose fiction, goes beyond what I call the cinematic view, which is when you end up writing like it's a screenplay. Person walks over here, they do this, like you're sitting passively watching it on a screen. It's very easy to do that instinctively, and I think that's actually a good way to do first drafts. Quite frankly, get the story out, get the events out, understand what's actually going on, as though you're watching it as a movie in a passive experience. But then you got to go back and bring the life to it. Get us inside the character's body, get us inside their head, and really wrap us up in it. And that can be why scenes just feel flat. When you're reading through it, it's okay. This is a lot of description of events, but I'm not actually there,
Right.
and that's usually because we're just detached.
This is actually a really good point. Millicent says, getting into sentences is sometimes confusing because we should reduce sensing words like saw, hear, watch, feel, because they're telling us what the characters are perceiving instead of showing. Yeah, to some degree, um, when we're talking about sensory detail, it can be very helpful that rather, let's say you're writing about me and it's like Daniel walked into the room, Daniel felt this, Daniel smelled that. Instead, if you said Daniel walked in the room, the smell of whatever happened, there was a feeling of this against skin, like that, all that changes it from talking about it distantly to like now it's you're there because you feel like that. You are smelling that essentially. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
And
and how,
especially
and
first person can be very helpful.
how does the character respond to that? It's just the easiest way to switch that around when you think you're
Right.
falling into that trap of, Daniel felt the cold, is have him shudder. He shudders against the
Yeah.
cold because of it. It's the effect that it's having on the person. How do they
Right.
show that? And like Daniel said with smells, smell is a very internal perception, and you can think of lots of great ways for smells if it's something that they really like, and it just kind of washes over them and relaxes them. You describe the smell like that instead of saying he smelled. It's the smell of, I don't know, what do you like, Daniel? Lilac or
I like this. He feels months of bleach. Yeah, that'd probably be more negative reaction. But to Garrett's point, it'd be like I flinched at the scent of bleach, right? Exactly. Uh, sure. I mean, bleach is really not too bad. I'm a strange person though, because I like the taste of Listerine, and I know that's really weird. Okay, it's like reader confessions. Don't forget to hook the reader again. This could be what's broken about your scene, and that is that you neglected to get the reader invested in the scene early on. Um, I'd like to think of scenes as really re-earning the audience's trust all over again, because the audience essentially has to understand pretty fast why it is they're concerned with what's going on in the scene. Now, granted, the further along you are in the book, probably the less important this gets. But you'll notice great writers do this, or effective writers do this. You can find writers that you find to be real page turners. And what you'll notice is they'll often begin scenes with a very clear idea to the audience of why they should care for the next few pages. They'll bring up the potential conflict going on, or, they'll remind you of the stakes, or they'll point to what the pivot point of the scene is going to be very early on. They don't. It's rare that it'll just kind of drag its heels, because it is, as soon as you get that information, again, it's that trackable goal, right? So if you start the scene and you're like, they entered the room hoping to accomplish X, well, automatically we know, okay, well, we're going to find out, are they going to accomplish X? Versus you could say, well, they entered the room and the room looked like this, and then they started to do this and whatever. And then finally you get like a few pages in, they're like, oh, and then they want to accomplish X. It may not be the best, because the longer you go without the audience being clear about what it is that they should be concerned about, the less interested they're going to be up to that point. At least that's how I tend to look at it. What do you think, Gareth, about kind of re-earning your audience's trust along the way?
yeah, love your hooks.
Love your
Learn
hooks.
to love your hooks, and I think a part of that too is
Drag them through that story.
goes into the scenes before, if you think of it that way as well. And sometimes most people should know when I talk about scenes, I often use scenes and chapters interchangeably because I tend to just break them up that way. I know some people like to have multiple scenes in a chapter.
Hmm.
You can do that for sure.
Or break
But
up your scene to make a cliffhanger too is very common.
exactly right. Like the way I describe this is a whole series of scenes can be part of one event that has been chopped up and spread all across the book because you're constantly dipping in and out of it. And a great way to kind of fuel people for easy acceptance going into the next scene is to make sure you have a great final hook in the scene before. That something is kind of hanging off there, or that's an idea that things are still unsolved and unresolved, and like, okay, I got to keep reading. Is a good way to ensure a positive entry into this scene. So don't neglect the scene before, how that finishes. But also, yes, going into the new scene, hit them with another little hook in the beginning. And again, that's can be a reminder. Like I said, if you have a scene that's all chopped up and you're coming back into that event, well, then that's your reminder. You just kind of it can be one word, it can be a sentence. You kind of flood the reader back with all of the knowledge of what came before. It's like, oh yeah, we're back here now. Excellent. I'm just going to rock it on with this. And then, of course, that ends with another little hook, and it's just like a chain, like I mentioned earlier, just chains on and on
Yep.
and on. Just
Yep.
keep people turning pages.
Yep. I love this scratch and sniff books. Well, you can't do that. That's kind of the point, right? So that's why you got to have sensory detail. um, Although that's your goal, right? Your goal is to make it feel almost like that. Yeah, no, in terms of hooking the audience, like we talked about trackable goals earlier, right? That a scene should have a goal to the audience that is trackable. And to me, when I think of the hook, I think of cluing into the audience what that trackable goal is, and then also restating or reminding or keeping at the forefront of the audience's mind the emotional stakes for the character, just to keep them going. And you'd be surprised when you look for this how telegraphed this tends to be. You might be overly concerned as a writer that you're like, well, I can't be too on the nose about, this scene is about X because that's kind of bland. You'd be surprised if you go through scenes and you really look at scenes in books at how much writers actually basically do that. It's not it's a good idea to get your footing. I tried to never hook my readers that way they throw the book away after 10 pages and can't complain after the other 19
It's a
chapters.
strategy.
No, it's true. Like, this is the problem, right? A lot of authors will put their works out there and they'll be out on Amazon. Maybe they self-published. They got pretty good reads from their beta readers, and they put it out there, and then they're like, it's just not kind of doing anything. And that's sometimes the worst feedback you can get, is like no feedback, because it feels like nobody's finishing it, nobody's writing a review, and sometimes it's things like this, right? They're just not hooked throughout. It's not anything horrible. You're just not cluing them in enough. You're not. It's like a marketing problem in a sense, right? It's almost like you're not marketing your scene well enough within the book. It's kind of weird, but I don't know. You may not like that analogy, but if it works for you, it works for you. Consider a scenery swap. Yes. Is this really necessary that this is the 20th time that they are planning some heist within the same bar that they've been a million times? It might make the scene a little bit boring. It might actually break it because you've been here so many times that you might, first of all, either neglect the senses, or even if you're in the senses, well, we've seen this before, so it's not that terribly interesting to hear it again. And what it can do is take a scene that is boring into a scene that is much more interesting, if the scenery itself is a bit of a character and can be at odds with what is going on. So if instead of planning their heist inside a bar, and it's the same bar they've been to a million years, well, they're planning a heist outside at a playground, and there's a bunch of obnoxious kids that make it hard for them to have a conversation about it, and then it starts raining or something. Well, the scene might become a little bit more interesting, just in a sense. It might give that extra bit of color that can help get you through something like that. Uh, Gareth, do you ever do this? Do you ever troubleshoot a scene by switching where people are? Have you ever
Yeah,
done
it's
that?
it's, it's great advice. I've had this question before. It's kind of what do I do or what can I do about scenes that are taking place in boring settings? And really, the answer is don't use boring settings. Move them
Right.
somewhere else. You
Yeah.
you you have the power to do that. It doesn't have
Mm.
to be in a boring
No.
setting. Get them somewhere more active, where there's
Yeah.
more going on around them.
Right.
And double points, really, if things can happen in the background there that almost intrude on that conversation or get to allow you to use additional little character points. I'm always using examples, I'm always putting kids in peril for some reason. But if you moved a
It
scene that would
works.
would be face to face over the table in a boring old empty diner, move it to a public park where they're both sitting there and everybody's family's going back and forth, and a kid is cycling dangerously and falls off and scrapes their knee and starts crying, next to the characters, something like that. How can something like that intrude on that space for a moment? And how do the characters react? Do they help? Does one of them just kind of laugh at this kid and show you something about them? How do you do that? Active dynamic settings can be a really really great uh, little injection of energy to any scene that feels a bit flat.
Oh, sure. And I mean, we were talking last week, and this is a little plug for last week for dialogue. The whole metaphor approach, the when the person tells a story that's a stand-in for what they're going to say, and a scenery swap can help that with that as well, right? Because you can have, this 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 gangster or whatever over a lake, and they can start talking about, it's like, well, there's lots of fish in the lake, and some of them are the prey and some of them are the predators, and the prey need to watch it, you know what I mean? And they can have a conversation based on what they're looking at, which can sometimes make the metaphor land a little bit more elegantly than if they just start being poetic out of context. It just depends. I mean, you can do
Yeah,
that. Depends on the character. But when they have something right in front of them to use as a metaphor, it can be very helpful. And the other thing too, you can do as an audience, as an artist, is you can use the scenery as a bit of a metaphor in of itself. Maybe you can get heavy-handed with that, or maybe a little bit too clever by half. But I tend to like that. I think of like Hitchcock did that a lot with different things, and I think it's fun.
yeah. Speaking of Hitchcock in that sense, a lot what he did a lot as well was having these really heightened and threatening conversations taking place in bustling areas.
Yeah.
So
Uh-huh.
if you have a scene that you're thinking is just not really working as a confrontation, it's a little too, let's say the gangsters at the lake, the main character's
Right.
not going to get any help there. That's plain. But what if you move that to somewhere that's really populated? What if that exact
Yeah.
same conversation, those exact same threats, and that same amount of threat
Yeah.
actually takes place in a ringside at a boxing match or a
Right.
wrestling match or something like that with a gigantic crowd, yet you still get the impression that this character will not be getting any help,
Yeah.
even with so many people around them, can
Right.
amp up the suspense and the tension immeasurably, and it
Hmm.
obviously increase the threat of your villain as well, because it feels like even in a crowded place, you're not safe.
Yeah. And it can restrain you in a nice way, because again, going back to last week with dialogue, on the nose dialogue tends to be a little bit bland. Dialogue with subtext tends to be a lot more interesting. And if you have a situation where somebody is throttled by the environment, right? They can't actually speak full out, and it forces them to talk in subtext. It does just raise the tension. It could be really effective. I think of like the movie Red Eye that plays on that a lot.
Yeah.
All right, let's see here. I mean, essentially the whole thing is based on scenery, right? Where it is. Avoid single problems. Think of your scene as not necessarily just one problem that needs to be solved. Ask yourself if there are more problems that characters are trying to solve. Generally speaking, especially the further you are in the book, there's more going on than just one major problem in the world, right? There are multiple plots, multiple things, and yes, you probably should juggle them and focus on not too much at once. But on the other hand, if you're so hyper focused that everything is just about one major conflict, one major goal, well, it can just make the scene rather bland and very one note, um, and it can also hurt the momentum of the book altogether, because it means essentially you're just dropping all of those other concerns that the audience might have about the other plots and just putting them off to the side. And you don't necessarily want to do that. You want to kind of keep the momentum up in multiple directions. And sometimes, too, it's like, I say, don't leave free money on the ground, right? If you have plots that can coincide and it creates more complication by the fact that they're rubbing against each other, well, that can make a much more compelling story than if you constantly are just compartmentalizing them into different little buckets.
Yeah, yeah, it's kind of tying them together. I was about to say just before you said it there, this is a good opportunity to tie your A story and B stories, together. If you have subplots that are going on, that now avoid single problems. My advice for this would be that it's not necessarily that the character is spinning plates, and they're really bogged down with 35 things that they have to personally deal with, but
Right.
that they do have things that they are worried about, things that are sitting on their shoulders that not necessarily they have to do, but are tied into the major problem and are taking up headspace, and that can tie into a subplot that's going on. For example, the in this scene, the character is dealing with this problem, but they are also acutely aware or made aware that like Team B has not reported in, and
Yeah.
they are key to all of this. So that's something to worry about. They're not
Exactly.
just focused on this one thing. Again,
E-
it's all about kind of dynamics and dynamism.
Exactly. And it's you using all of the tools that you've put in for yourself, especially like I said, as the story progresses. As the story progresses, progresses, you should have more and more tools at your disposal because you're constantly giving yourself more things to work with, right? And you want to keep working with them, especially before you add more. So when I say avoid single problems, I don't mean necessarily just to keep adding problems because that's just going to completely fall apart. But as you get through the book, don't forget about all the other problems you've set up. You know what I mean? And keep working with them. Don't uh, don't don't neglect the fact that you can have multiple things going on at once. I like this. Please consider wearing a green shirt for your next conversation and being a floating disembodied head for the whole thing. I might very well do that at some point.
We can do it in
I'm glad.
stages. You gradually disappear and it goes
Sparkles,
further
cool.
up.
It's funny because ultimately I'm kind of making my point about how not just being too monotone actually benefits a scene, right? Because it's created a little bit of of interest and something else to talk about, and that's actually cool. So there we go. It was all planned, everybody. It was all planned. All right. What's next? Trackable goal for the scene itself. I think we already talked about that. Hold on. Try adding a third wheel. Yes, your characters, who's in the scene, right? When I say third wheel, I don't necessarily mean, oh, you only have two characters, you have to add a third person. What I specifically mean is somebody is in the scene that doesn't want to be in the scene. Like, or they are actually very contrary to what the scene is trying to accomplish. It can be very helpful to have that friction. If you have a scene where people are trying to get something done and somebody is really bad at it, doesn't want to do it, would rather do something else, it can make a scene much more interesting than if the main characters are mostly in agreement and just trying to get something done. Because even though there's a little bit of conflict there, right? Because let's say they're trying to fix their car, right? Well, the conflict is they have to deal with the mechanics of fixing a car, and it might not work and all of that. But if you have a third wheel that is also like, well, I don't really want to be doing this. Who really cares? It could make the scene a lot more interesting. And you can extrapolate that even bigger than that basic example. And
Yeah,
certainly for dialogue, it can be really helpful.
it can go in all sorts of directions.
It
And one
really
of these,
can.
I think this speaks to the idea of amalgamation as well,
Hmm.
which is one of the things that you can do to really help a scene. Because when something is going on in that scene, and that's kind of the point of it, and you don't really want to do away with that. That I guess is really what we're talking about here. Is that scene is broken, but it has a core of information
Right.
that is necessary. You may think about this. It's like add a conflict. I'm always banging on about adding conflict. Just again make it dynamic in a sense. So adding another character in there who is contrary to it, you can extrapolate that further. Is like, okay, well, what if, and going to the settings that we talked about as well, is what if what's going on in this scene actually should involve this other character that already exists, because they're a great foil for this. They're a really great way to amp this up or add a bit more push and pull. And by virtue of adding them, it really ought to be taking place in their shop. Let's say. So
Mhm.
you change everything. So the setting becomes different. There's an extra character in there to bring it up, but you're still utilizing the same core. What was needed to be brought across in that scene.
Right. I think of an example of this is an example I often bring up as a scene. This is a scene that is a difficult scene to pull off, and that's in Star Wars: A New Hope. You have the scene where they basically just have to tell the audience, "This is what the Death Star can do," and some people want to use it, and some people don't, and everything. And so there's this boardroom scene, right? But what you ultimately have are a bunch of different people, but particularly you have this one person that is essentially the third wheel, and that he's adding a different wrinkle in it where he starts making fun of Darth Vader's Jedi skills, and then Darth Vader does the classic line, "I find your lack of faith disturbing," and he chokes him. And the fact that George Lucas was able to get a quotable line out of an expository scene of just a lot of blah blah blah, we got to do this sort of stuff, is very effective. It's quite an accomplishment. So that's something to think about. That sort of situation allows for that sort of thing. I have used a friend to the main character to expand on the thoughts of the main character. Is that good? That can be good. Often having somebody else for the main character to talk to is a lot better than the main character either having to navel gaze, just think a lot about themselves, or kind of awkwardly, you know, um, share information to people that they shouldn't. The fact that you have a friend, well, we tend to confide in our friends more than we confide to other people. So that can actually work very well. I mean, granted, just like anything else, you can go too far and you can end up where the character is just venting and blah blah blah, and that might not land very well. But yeah, theoretically, that sounds fine. What do you think, Gareth?
Yeah, it's an ideal way. Like Daniel said, it's organic because we open up to friends. We have conversations with friends that we wouldn't necessarily have with other people, and having them talk to another person or to a friend is usually leagues better than having someone sitting talking to themselves, or
That was the other
walking
question.
around.
What if they do? We'll talk
Okay.
about that in a second.
Yeah, I mean it can be fine, but it's often off-putting. It's one of these things that personally I very much dislike is characters verbalizing what they've just learned or goals that they've just they pick up a book and they look through it and then they just say out loud what it is they need to do.
I
Usually
can't
that
believe that they did that. Yeah, that could be
yeah,
very
it
annoying.
drives me batty. I don't like it because quite often it's cheating the audience out of a bit of work because we watch them do the things, we see them make the decision, and we make that decision. I remember back what I said about we can play the guessing game in terms of goals and what they're going to do next. You rob the audience of that joy of that interactivity when you just have the
Yeah,
characters say it out loud for no reason,
yeah.
and nobody walks around all day talking to themselves.
You
Um,
don't? I'm just kidding.
well, no, I barely talk to others, let alone myself. But
I know.
it's rare. We do
Yeah,
occasionally, like I say. I don't mean to say it, nobody ever talks to themselves because of course we do. We say things out loud, but you don't do it all day long, and certainly not for no reasons. Might cuss out loud for some reason usually, but that's about it.
yeah.
Um, so
And even
kind of
then, that's not like, wow, I can't believe I stubbed my toe. That's an exclamation. That's just this response, right? It's like it's just a guttural response. It's not you repeating information the audience already knows.
Yeah, part of that's actually a pretty decent example of this is somebody walking through a room and stubs their toe, and then they go, oh, that hurts. Now, you would generally say that if someone else is in the room, because you're trying to give that information to the other person, that hurts. I'm in pain.
Yeah,
If you're on your own, you're less likely to actually go, oh, that hurts, and explain why it
right,
hurts, because nobody's listening to you.
right.
Instead, you hop around just emoting and going, because you're there by yourself. You don't need to verbalize it in actual communicative sense of specific words. So
Yeah,
that's a pretty good example of ways you can cut back. However, kind of rolling back around to the initial question there of the other character. Yes, friends are good. You just don't want them to end up becoming an obvious um, s-
information dump
yeah,
essentially.
that they are simply a mechanism that's
Yeah,
there so that you're not having the main character talk to themselves because that can be
right,
very, very transparent and
right.
quite annoying. Make sure that the friend is a character in themselves with their own things going on and the reasons that they're having these conversations are valid. And
Yeah.
it's not just expository. But yeah, I mean, as a general function, yeah, good.
Yeah. Well, it's also like there's other characters. This is kind of a side point, but just while we're talking about it, there's like the Hermione character who's just the character who knows a lot about everything. So whenever somebody's talking about something, they can just give exposition, and that can be overused. That can also be used well. And then you also have the idiot character. Or the character with no background information about what's going on, so that people have to explain it to them, and therefore the audience, that can be used well, that can be abused as well. So they're all mechanical ways of getting things done. The trick is that while we will always, we writers will always know that's what the writer is doing, the audience really should not, or at least it should not be like so blatant that that's what's going on. And I think one way to solve that is by having them serve more than that function. So getting back to the friend, I would say if the only purpose of the friend is to tell you more about the main character, well, you're not really doing the friend a lot of justice, because the friend doesn't think they live in a world where the only thing that matters is the main character, right? The friend lives in a world where they're the most important, where they have a life. So and I'm not saying you're doing that. I'm just saying that's something to watch out for. All right. I'm just trying to catch up on comments here. I have used an adversary in a scene to create tension. Yes, we're going to talk about adversaries in scenes for sure, because yes, that is incredibly helpful. Some people say that they even do it when they're alone. It's like the old, if you stub your toe in the woods and nobody's there, did it actually
Did it actually make a sound?
did it actually
Yes.
make sense?
In a dramatic sense, generally not. No. I mean, to each their own. As I say, most people. It doesn't mean literally everybody.
Gareth is speaking in generalities, everybody.
Yes, and for example, let me go beyond that. So yes, if you are the kind of person, let's say I saw a comment there about a splinter. Say, oh, freaking splinter, shoot, is going beyond that. Now, somebody in a general reading sense, you would want to read the Splinter. Of course, you get a bit of their reaction. I saw a comment there: "Classic show don't tell issue." It pretty much is.
Yeah,
You show that happening. Now, the next thing is, well, how do they get the splinters out? So, the tweezers usually is you then have the character vocalizing, and they go tweezers, tweezers. Where are the tweezers? And then go looking for the tweezers. That dialogue is not necessary at all.
yeah,
It's not going to happen. Take it out. They're
yeah.
talking to themselves for no reason. We
Right.
know they're likely to do something about the splinter, so we just watch them, figuratively watch them.
Yeah.
Look for something, find the tweezers, and take the splinter out. We don't need them talking about it.
No. Yeah, and this is the point where this is not about necessarily. I mean, granted, I think Gareth is right. On average, people don't do this, but the point is even if they did, it still wouldn't dramatically really help anything because we know, right? The reason why people often communicate information is to tell you something you don't know. If you can know it or infer it without the words being needed, then the words are not needed. And as an artist, that's your goal, right? You're not a stenographer, you're an artist. You're trying to make something compelling. All right. Keep the threat of the obstacle alive in your scene. And when I mean obstacle, I mean whatever is keeping the protagonist from their goal. Usually there's a big obstacle that's keeping them from their goal. Now, this could mean that you might have missed an opportunity to have the obstacle in the scene. Perhaps. Often, though, I will say it's not a surprise that you didn't include the obstacle because the main character can only face off the obstacle so many times and fail before the obstacle starts to just kind of lose its weight. So often what you'll do to keep the threat of the obstacle alive rather than actually have the obstacle in the scene is mention the obstacle, show how the obstacle is a threat. So let's say the obstacle, the main character wants to get to a treasure and the obstacle is a dragon. Well, what you might show is uh, they're in a scene and there's a reminder of the ferociousness of the dragon just kind of casually thrown in there just to keep that alive for the audience. The other thing too that could be brought in is another similar animal or force that the main character has to face off as a little like sub boss. But I think it is important in your scene to keep that main antagonistic force present if you can. And like I said, doesn't mean like physically present in the scene, but they should be at least alluded to.
Yeah, it's kind of shadow of the plot, kind of
Yeah,
hanging
it's just
over.
it helps keep you try and it keeps that tension alive, right? Because that's the main tension of the book is going to be the protagonist wants something, there's an obstacle in the way. Are they going to defeat the obstacle? And I would say most scenes should allude to it at least somewhat. Now, you might be like, wow, that's really repetitive, but you might be surprised in how many different ways you can actually allude to this and it doesn't seem as repetitive as you think. And particularly, this is again talking about a broken scene, right? It could be that the broken scene would be helped if you just keep that undercurrent of the main tension. I'm
Yeah.
not saying you have to every single time. All right, let's keep going. I don't know how many of these there are. I forgot. So I think we might be nearing the end. Find an analog scene. Find a scene that is similar to the scene you are working on. Because broken scenes, I would say often broken scenes are scenes that are a little bit thorny to write. Usually, the scenes that, at least when I find I'm talking to people, they're not concerned about the big, the movie trailer scenes, those core scenes where it's like, this was what I was super excited about. It's the moment that they finally reach Atlantis and it's so beautiful. Like usually that's the scene that's pretty easy because it's interesting and it's exciting. It's the scenes that set it up. It's the scenes that where conflicts are resolved, more of the mechanical scenes than the fun stuff. So what I would suggest you do is find a similar scene, and I would say don't think about it in terms of genre, because this is we're dealing with the what's going on mechanically, right? Look at a similar scene. So, for example, if it was a planning scene, find a planning scene in another work. Particularly find one that you think is really good. So if you're going to do a planning scene, I might like look at a heist plot, because heist plots, there's so much about them that's about planning, that the author has to make those very interesting. Or or you can even watch a movie or something. You're looking at the mechanics. This is not necessarily the word level I'm talking about. But what you might find are some interesting ideas, and they're like, oh, well, they included this element, or there was this little twist, and I didn't think about that. I didn't think of doing it in that way, approaching it that way. It could be very helpful.
Yeah, I think this is why reading is just as important as writing.
It's true.
When you want to be a writer.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is great. Just look at what other people are doing as well, and you don't necessarily have to copy, but break it down. Look at what's going
Yeah.
on. Kind of, I guess the way I always refer to it is kind of shot by shot, quote unquote, within this scene. How's it built? How's it
Yeah.
constructed? And how's it coming across?
Right.
And mirror that. You can always model off what's worked.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, going back to the example I talked about earlier, the the conference room scene of Star Wars, right? Let's say that you wanted to kind of copy that. Well, what's going on mechanically is you have, multiple viewpoints, but you particularly have one character that insults the core beliefs of the big boss, whoever's making the plan, and then they kind of lash out and there's a moment. So you might be like, okay, maybe I need to do that, because maybe I have that way I get across the core beliefs of the boss. I have that. You might think you want to do something similar mechanically without having it to be exactly the same thing. Uh, it can give you a clue into something like that. All right. Next we have. I think that might be it. Hold on. Oh, no, here we go. Tie scenes together through consequences. Yes, we were talking about that a little bit earlier. Ultimately, one reason why a scene might be broken is that it just kind of feels like it doesn't belong with anything. It's there, and you as an artist, where you're like, oh, I totally understand why the scene exists, but the audience doesn't quite know why it's even kind of there. It just kind of feels like it comes and it goes. So this is where having like Gareth was talking about with the chain, right? You want everything to feel like it's interlocked with another one. And a common piece of writing advice that I use, this came from the writers of South Park. There's a video from them talking about it, because they have to do story development like super super quick because they have so much output. And what they said is the main thing you want to worry about is if you can put and in between your scenes, right? Because and could be in between anything. You can say, I walked out to my car, and a buffalo walked across the plains in Wyoming, and a woman gave birth, and none of this has to do with each other. So you're like, why are you telling me all these random things? But what they suggest is between your scenes, you want to look for the word but or therefore. And if you can do that, you're going to tie it together. Because if I said, I walked outside, therefore there's a buffalo running across Wyoming. Well, it's like, well, how did those two tie together? And now you're writing a story in which walking outside somehow is affecting buffalo. And if you're not, then that buffalo does not need to exist, right? That's the point. Um, it should tie together, scene to scene. Another way that I've seen people handle this is they think of scenes as asking a question. So the main character, it's like they're trying to storm the castle. Are they successful? Yes, no. And then they apply yes, but, and no, and. So it's are they're storming the castle? Are they successful? Yes, but there's a big troll inside the castle. Or no, and now there's an army that captured them. And you can see again, you're just building and building and building. And the idea is you just keep doing that over and over again. It's just a way to tie your scenes together. And again, this kind of goes back to the hook, right? Gareth even mentioned this earlier. The hook of a scene should naturally follow the consequences of the last scene and just kind of keep that audience rolling through. Gareth?
Yeah, I love this one, of course.
I know this is like your bread and butter. So preach,
Yeah,
man.
it goes into kind of one of my big activities that I do get people to do, and I just call it the causal chain. This making sure that things go through the plot from start to finish with actual consequences. The Before you even said it, I haven't seen that South Park video, but I was thinking replace the word "and" with "therefore."
Yeah.
And then you said it, and yeah, pretty much exactly that. Break it down and check that these therefores are in between, that there is a chain of cause and effect that's running through this that seems to actually give a direction to things. And it seems like your character is up against things because they're facing pushback from the world because of their actions.
Right.
Everything is happening for a reason, and usually the protagonist is that reason, the things that they're doing. Now, of course, that's not 100% that a hard and fast rule, that there's nothing flexible that works around the periphery of that, because of course there is. Stories are
Right.
kind of living breathing things until they're fully in order. But so for example, if you were chaining from the beginning to end, quite often a story isn't so straightforward and told in such a straightforward way that yes, of course, every scene in every chapter chains directly into the next. That rarely, if ever, actually happens, because we're going to duck in and out of different places and especially visit subplots. However, even if it's broken up, if you map this out for yourself and check that the chain is in place, well, then you can see when you look at your overview is, oh, well, okay, the chain kind of broke here at chapter 7 because it needed to, because we went off to a subplot for a bit. But when we come back to what's going on in that initial plot, are we chaining back in again? Is there still a link? Things haven't become broken there. Great. If they have, we have a problem. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. The ultimate goal, again, it's like bricks in a building. The ultimate goal should be that removing some of these, you wouldn't be able to remove too many before the whole thing would come apart. Some of them maybe, would just give a little less structure, but not too many. And if you're not doing that, then that means you're not really adding bricks. You're just kind of piling things in a weird haphazard sort of way. Here's a question. How much of this is pre-planned and how much is spontaneous? Any advantages either way? I'm assuming you mean the entire writing process. I would say that will vary. There are people that will literally go down to even the scene level for their planning, although I would say that level of detail is pretty rare. Most of the time, it's more of an overarching plot, right? But this is what we're talking about today is what mostly going to happen when you're completely done with your first draft, or maybe even a few drafts in and you still realize it's a problem, right? And at that point, you're troubleshooting. But certainly all of these tips can be helpful as you're writing, as you're planning, right? So if you're a planner and you like to outline, we talk about it all the time, but we have our story beat worksheet and you can check it out. And you can also go back to our video archives and look up our story beats, and you can make sure that all of these beats, troubleshoot it with these sort of tips, and see if the beats are working like that for the scenes. And sometimes scenes will have multiple story beats, so it's not an exact science there. um, but if you're more of a pantser type, a gardener type, and your story just flows organically, that's fine. It just means on your rewrite, on your development editing side, you're going to need to go through these scenes and make sure that they have these elements, because probably you're going to need to tweak them, and you're going to need to turn up the temperature on some things, adjust some things, and things like that. And not that planners don't, but you know, there's
Yeah.
more rewriting often in gardening than not.
Yeah, you do you, boo. It's whatever
Exactly.
way works for you. It can be fully planned
I
from
plan
start to
out
finish.
every
Yeah, like
scene.
Beth there, plan out every scene. Know it
If
before you
that
sit down to write
works,
it. If that
yeah,
works for you, great.
that
Some
is
people like
not
to.
Gareth's approach.
Yeah, I plan probably about 50%, maybe 60% of the way, and
Yeah,
then just run with it in the middle. I think if you are running with it, just the whole pantser thing by the seat of your pants and making it up as you go along. One of the strongest things I think you could do is just keep that chain of consequences in mind. It can help keep you on track.
right.
As you go, so you don't end up meandering too much, because that's probably the biggest curse of the pantser, is just getting
Yeah,
lost away from the plot. Don't fight that too much. Make sure you still have a kind of chain of consequences in your mind as you go. Keep up that therefore. So this just happened in that scene I wrote.
yeah,
Therefore, what's likely to be the next thing
right.
that directly reflects off of that? Follow that. And sometimes, if you're pantsing, that might lead you just down a whole other path than your actual plot. Stick with it for a bit, because you never know what ideas can come out of that, interesting other things, and you can always edit it afterwards. Writing is rewriting.
No, totally true. And I would say too, when it comes to pantsing, I some of these tips are still helpful, like in the flow, right? Because pantsing doesn't mean flying by the seat of the pants to the point when you're writing a scene you don't necessarily know what the scene is about, right? I would think you normally do. It's not that it's not that close in on pantsing, right? You just are only a few steps ahead, right? So as you're that few steps ahead, think about some of these things. Is there a trackable goal going on in this scene? And then to Garrett's point, a scene is a question. Ultimately, what is the character trying to do? What are they trying to accomplish? Do they accomplish it? Yes, but no, and goes to the next question. uh, or goes to the next scene, excuse me. And so then the next time you sit down and you're pantsing the next scene, well, you're like, okay, what was the question? Okay, yes, but and then what does that mean for this? You know what I mean? Like, you just keep it going. And that'll make your development edit a lot easier than if you're just completely going off on tangents.
Yeah, I was going to say it often is the next question as well,
Yeah.
because it's here's what's happened, and now what are they going to do about it?
Right.
That's
Yeah,
the
yeah,
next question.
right. Yeah, yeah, right. Because if it's like, they're trying to storm the castle, do they get in? Yes, but there's a big troll inside. Then the question is, well, what do they do about the troll inside? You know what I mean? Yeah. So then and it's just another question. Exactly. All right. Those are some of our tips on how to fix a broken scene. I certainly had a great time talking to all of you. I'm trying to figure out what we are doing next week. I believe yes, it is the Valentine's time frame. It's the day after. It's actually my favorite holiday of the year. It is Discount Chocolate Day here in the United States. So for Discount Chocolate Day, February 15th, we're going to be talking about how to fall in love with your story again. Because as you may realize, as you get in the weeds, as you start to development edit and word edit and think about all these things, well, guess what? You can diagnose yourself into an oblivion to the point where you think everything is awful and the whole thing is just a pile of garbage. In fact, I was just coaching somebody who had that problem. I think they're in this chat. And they came to me and they're like, everything is awful. It's a pile of garbage. And I'm like, no, it's not, because we get there and that's very normal. So we're going to talk about how do you rediscover your passion for your work and honestly, sometimes even just for your writing yourself itself when you're kind of down in the dump. So we're gonna talk a little bit about that. Anything else you have in your mind, Gareth, before we wrap things up?
No, that's it for next week. I guess bring your chocolate as we once again
I
fall in
promise
love
I
with
will
your
not
writing.
eat. I will not eat delicious chocolate on air. That would be rude. I don't know though. I might. I really like chocolate. That's gonna be
I might
sitting
not
in
be
my.
on camera. I'll be sitting here covered in it all over my face.
Is that a UK thing too to get discount chocolate the day after Valentine's Day?
No,
Oh,
well, never really thought about it. Not a big chocolate fan, so I don't really
uh,
know.
of course not. It's sweet and delicious. No,
It's not bitter and
it's not
sour.
bitter and somber. Yeah. Can't wait to see that in your floating head. I don't think I'm going to do the floating head for Fall in Love. That just seems not quite congruous. We'll have to pick some sort of like I don't know horror topic or something like that. So anyway, we'll see you next week, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us here around AutoCrit, and we'll see you next week. Bye,
Thank you all.
everybody.
Bye bye.